When the Panzer IV was conceived in the mid-1930s, it was not meant to become the symbol of German armored warfare. It was designed quietly, almost modestly, as a supporting vehicle, a tank whose primary role was not to hunt enemy armor, but to assist it. At the time, German planners believed wars would be short, decisive, and won through speed and coordination rather than prolonged industrial struggle. Early German armored doctrine divided tanks into roles. Lighter, faster vehicles were expected to engage enemy tanks, while the Panzer IV was intended to support infantry and suppress enemy defenses. Its short-barreled gun was optimized for high-explosive shells, ideal for destroying bunkers, anti-tank guns, and fortified positions. On paper, it was a secondary machine, useful but not dominant. Yet even in its earliest form, the Panzer IV carried an unspoken advantage. It was balanced, its chassis was robust, its suspension reliable, and its internal layout allowed room for upgrades. Unlike more experimental designs, it was built with practicality in mind. German engineers, perhaps unknowingly, had created a platform with long-term potential. As Germany rearmed and the Wehrmacht prepared for war, the Panzer IV entered service alongside lighter tanks. It was not celebrated. It did not inspire fear, but it was dependable. Crews found it manageable. Maintenance units found it serviceable. Commanders found it predictable, a quality that would soon matter more than raw performance. When war erupted in 1939, the Panzer IV moved forward with the first armored columns. In Poland and France, it performed its intended role efficiently, supporting rapid advances and coordinated attacks. At this stage, it was one component of a carefully tuned system, not yet the centerpiece. But war has a way of reshaping intentions. As campaigns expanded, enemies adapted, and conflicts stretched far beyond original plans, the German army would be forced to rely on what worked, not what was envisioned. And slowly, almost without announcement, the Panzer IV began its transformation, from a supporting actor into the backbone of an army fighting a war it had never planned to endure. The early victories of Germany's armored forces masked a growing problem. As the Panzer IV rolled through Poland and Western Europe, it faced opponents who were unprepared, under-equipped, or tactically outmatched. But this advantage would not last. War was evolving, and the Panzer IV would have to evolve with it, or be left behind. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 shattered many German assumptions. On the vast plains of the East, German tanks encountered new enemies, heavier, better armored, and increasingly numerous. Suddenly, the Panzer IV's original short-barreled gun was no longer enough. Engagements that once favored speed and coordination now demanded penetration and range. German engineers responded quickly. The Panzer IV's design, once considered unremarkable, proved its hidden strength. Its chassis allowed upgrades that other tanks could not easily accept. The gun was lengthened, armor was reinforced, firepower increased dramatically. What began as an infantry support tank was transformed into a capable anti-tank platform. This process was not elegant. Each improvement added weight, stress, and complexity. But unlike more specialized designs, the Panzer IV could absorb these changes without collapsing under them. It remained operable. It remained producible. And most importantly, it remained available in numbers that mattered. On the Eastern Front, adaptation was survival. Units equipped with Panzer IVs learned to fight defensively, exploiting terrain, coordinating ambushes, and relying on teamwork rather than brute force. The tank was no longer a supporting actor. It was often the best available option. While newer, more powerful tanks were introduced, they arrived slowly and in limited quantities. The Panzer IV, constantly modified and upgraded, continued to fill the gaps. It fought in snow, mud, and dust. It endured conditions that broke more ambitious designs. Under fire, the Panzer IV did not excel. It endured. And in a war increasingly defined by endurance rather than brilliance, that quality would prove decisive. As the war expanded across continents, the Panzer IV quietly became something no German tank had been designed to be: universal. While newer and more powerful machines captured attention, the Panzer IV kept appearing on every front, in every campaign, under every condition. In North Africa, it fought across open deserts where heat strained engines and dust clogged mechanisms. In the East, it endured mud seasons that swallowed vehicles whole and winters that froze steel solid. In Western Europe, it battled through hedgerows, villages, and narrow roads where visibility was limited and ambush was constant. Wherever German forces fought, the Panzer IV was present. This omnipresence was not accidental. Unlike heavier tanks, the Panzer IV could be transported more easily by rail and road. It required fewer specialized recovery vehicles. Its mechanics were understood by crews and maintenance units alike. When damaged, it could often be repaired and returned to service instead of abandoned. German commanders came to rely on it not because it was exceptional, but because it was dependable. When elite units with advanced tanks were unavailable, Panzer IVs filled the line. When supply shortages limited operations, the Panzer IV remained usable. When strategic plans collapsed, it was the Panzer IV that held defensive positions and delayed enemy advances. This constant presence shaped battlefield reality. Allied forces rarely encountered German armor without encountering the Panzer IV. It became the standard opponent, the tank most often faced, fought, and defeated. Not the Tiger, not the Panther, the Panzer IV. In this sense, it became the true face of German armored warfare. It carried the weight of campaigns long after original plans had failed. It absorbed losses, adapted tactics, and continued fighting when alternatives were unavailable or impractical. The Panzer IV did not dominate history through spectacle. It dominated through persistence. And as the war ground on, that persistence became both its greatest strength and a reflection of the desperate situation it was now forced to endure. As the war entered its middle years, the Panzer IV found itself trapped between two extremes. On one side stood lighter Allied tanks that it could still defeat with skill and positioning. On the other loomed newer enemy designs, better armored, better armed, and increasingly supported by overwhelming numbers. The Panzer IV was no longer advancing into a future it could dominate. It was holding ground between giants. Allied tank development accelerated rapidly. Improved Shermans, British upgrades, and Soviet armor placed growing pressure on German units. Engagements became less forgiving. Where the Panzer IV once held clear advantages, it now relied on tactics, terrain, and coordination to survive. Direct confrontations were avoided whenever possible. German crews adapted accordingly. They learned to fight defensively, choosing firing positions carefully and exploiting concealment. Ambush replaced maneuver. Survival replaced breakthrough. The Panzer IV was no longer the spear, it was the shield. Meanwhile, Germany introduced heavier tanks intended to reclaim battlefield dominance. These machines promised superior firepower and armor, but they arrived too late, and in too few numbers. They were complex, resource-intensive, and difficult to sustain. As a result, they could not replace the Panzer IV, only supplement it. This placed an enormous burden on the older design. The Panzer IV was expected to fight enemies it had never been intended to face, under conditions far harsher than its designers imagined. Yet, it continued to serve, not because it was ideal, but because it was available. By 1943, the Panzer IV was no longer winning wars. It was buying time. Every defensive stand, every delayed advance, every stubborn position held by its crews represented an attempt to slow an enemy whose momentum was becoming unstoppable. Caught between past ambitions and future realities, the Panzer IV became the embodiment of Germany's armored dilemma. A tank asked to do too much, for too long, with too little support left to give. Behind the steel of the Panzer IV stood crews whose experience would come to define the tank as much as its design. As newer machines drew attention, it was these men, often overlooked, who carried the real burden of keeping Germany's armored forces operational. Panzer IV crews learned to fight with restraint and awareness. They understood their tank's limits intimately, where its armor was weakest, how far its gun could reliably penetrate, when to engage and when to withdraw. Survival depended not on bravado, but on discipline. A poorly chosen fight could end in seconds. Training became increasingly uneven as the war progressed. Early crews were well prepared, benefiting from extensive pre-war doctrine and coordinated tactics. Later crews arrived with fewer hours, less equipment, and almost no margin for error. Yet the Panzer IV's relative familiarity made it easier to train replacements compared to more complex tanks. Maintenance was a constant struggle. Spare parts grew scarce. Fuel shortages dictated operations. Crews often became mechanics by necessity, repairing damage under fire or improvising fixes with whatever was available. The Panzer IV's simpler systems, once unremarkable, now became a lifeline. Morale fluctuated with circumstances. Victories were rare, retreats were frequent. But the Panzer IV remained, a known quantity in an increasingly unpredictable war. Crews trusted it not because it was superior, but because it was understandable. In a battlefield filled with uncertainty, that trust mattered. The tank and its crew formed a relationship forged under pressure. As long as the Panzer IV could move and fire, it would be sent back into combat. And as long as crews climbed inside, the German armored force would continue fighting, even as the strategic situation collapsed around them. By 1943 and 1944, the Panzer IV was no longer the dominant tank it had once been. On paper, it was increasingly outclassed. Allied tanks grew more numerous and better supported. Soviet armor became heavier and more aggressive. Anti-tank weapons improved rapidly. Yet despite all this, the Panzer IV did not disappear. What kept it relevant was not superiority, but adaptability. German units adjusted tactics to compensate for technical disadvantages. Panzer IVs were positioned defensively, used in coordinated formations, and supported by infantry and anti-tank guns. They avoided open duels whenever possible, instead relying on ambush, terrain, and careful positioning. In many engagements, the Panzer IV was no longer expected to break through enemy lines. Its role shifted toward containment and delay, holding crossroads, covering retreats, counterattacking only when conditions were favorable. These were not glamorous missions, but they were essential to slowing Allied advances. Crucially, the Panzer IV remained easier to maintain than heavier German tanks. While more advanced designs suffered from mechanical failures and fuel demands, Panzer IV units were often the only armored elements capable of sustained operation. In retreat, Reliability mattered more than firepower. This reality reshaped its reputation. The Panzer IV was no longer seen as a cutting-edge weapon, but as a dependable tool in an increasingly desperate situation. It could not change the course of the war, but it could influence how quickly that course unfolded. Outmatched did not mean useless. As long as it could fight, the Panzer IV continued to serve, not as the future of armored warfare, but as the last reliable link to a past when Germany still believed it could control the battlefield. One reason the Panzer IV earned its reputation as the backbone of the Wehrmacht was simple. It fought everywhere, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, from the Balkans to Normandy. The Panzer IV was present in nearly every major German armored operation of the war. This versatility was no accident. Unlike heavier tanks, the Panzer IV could be transported more easily by rail and road. It coped better with poor infrastructure, extreme temperatures, and long marches. In North Africa, it faced sand, heat, and mechanical strain. In the East, it endured mud, snow, and brutal cold. While conditions often degraded performance, the tank remained usable where more specialized machines struggled. On the Eastern Front, the Panzer IV formed the core of German armored units for years. It fought Soviet T-34s and KV tanks in a constant cycle of adaptation. Crews learned to use terrain, coordination, and experience to compensate for technical inferiority. Losses were heavy, but replacements arrived, often in the form of more Panzer IVs. In Western Europe, the tank faced a different challenge. Allied air power limited movement and forced German armor to operate cautiously. Here, the Panzer IV's smaller size compared to heavier tanks became an advantage. It was easier to conceal, easier to move at night, and easier to integrate into defensive positions. The Panzer IV did not dominate these fronts. It endured them. Its presence gave German commanders a tool that could be deployed quickly, repaired locally, and used under a wide range of conditions. Even when defeated, it delayed, disrupted, and imposed costs. Fighting everywhere meant wearing out everywhere. But it also meant that when historians trace the armored battles of the war, the Panzer IV appears again and again, not as a footnote, but as a constant. By the middle years of the war, the Panzer IV was no longer the most advanced tank on the battlefield. New enemies appeared with sloped armor, heavier guns, and greater mobility. On paper, the Panzer IV should have been outclassed and replaced, but replacement never came in sufficient numbers. Instead of disappearing, the Panzer IV was upgraded again and again. Its gun was improved, giving it the ability to engage newer Allied and Soviet tanks at combat ranges. Additional armor was added. Optics and radios were refined. Each modification was an attempt to keep an aging design relevant in a rapidly evolving war. These changes did not make the Panzer IV dominant, but they made it viable. German armored units could still rely on it as a general-purpose tank, capable of fighting infantry, supporting assaults, and engaging enemy armor when necessary. It remained flexible in a way heavier tanks often were not. Crucially, crews understood it. Training, experience, and familiarity mattered. A tank that could be fought effectively by an experienced crew was often more dangerous than a superior machine handled poorly. In this sense, the Panzer IV's long service life became an advantage rather than a weakness. While newer German tanks drew attention and resources, the Panzer IV continued to shoulder the burden. It filled gaps, replaced losses, and formed the bulk of armored strength long after it should have been obsolete. The Panzer IV was not winning the technological race, but it was still running it. And in a war where survival mattered as much as innovation, that distinction was critical. Unlike Germany's heavier and more specialized tanks, the Panzer IV was not reserved for rare, decisive moments. It fought everywhere, and almost continuously. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, from the streets of Italian cities to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Panzer IV was always present. This constant deployment shaped its true role. The Panzer IV was not a breakthrough legend or a fear weapon. It was the everyday instrument of German armored warfare. When an offensive began, Panzer IV units were there. When defenses collapsed, they covered retreats. When fronts stabilized, they held the line. In North Africa, its reliability and manageable weight allowed it to operate where heavier tanks struggled with heat, dust, and supply. On the Eastern Front, it endured mud, snow, and extreme distances, often serving as the only available armored support for infantry divisions spread thin across vast terrain. By 1943 and 1944, Panzer IVs made up the majority of German tank strength on most fronts. Tigers and Panthers attracted attention, but they were too few to define daily combat. It was the Panzer IV that absorbed losses, fought delaying actions, and attempted to slow overwhelming enemy advances. This omnipresence came at a cost. Crews were exhausted. Vehicles were worn beyond intended limits. Many Panzer IVs were lost not in dramatic duels, but in routine actions, artillery strikes, air attacks, mechanical failures during withdrawals. Yet their constant presence also explains why the Panzer IV mattered more than its reputation suggests. Wars are not decided by exceptional moments alone. They are decided by who shows up day after day on every front, even when victory is no longer possible. And the Panzer IV kept showing up. As the war turned against Germany, the Panzer IV increasingly faced enemies it had never been designed to fight. New Allied tanks appeared with thicker armor, more powerful guns, and overwhelming numerical support. On paper, the Panzer IV was outclassed. On the battlefield, it was still fighting. German engineers pushed the design as far as it could go. Armor was thickened. The gun was upgraded again and again, eventually giving the Panzer IV the ability to engage Shermans and even threaten heavier opponents under the right conditions. Side skirts were added to counter new infantry weapons. Each modification kept the tank relevant, but also heavier, slower, and more strained. Unlike newer German designs, the Panzer IV could not rely on invincibility. Crews survived through positioning, camouflage, coordination, and experience. They avoided frontal duels when possible, fought from ambush, and relied on defensive terrain. Skill and caution replaced brute force. By 1944, Panzer IV units were often asked to perform impossible tasks, hold ground against overwhelming numbers, delay advances without air cover, and fight while retreating. Losses were heavy. Replacements were scarce. But the tank remained in service because there was no alternative that could be produced in sufficient numbers. The Panzer IV was no longer winning battles. It was buying time. Every kilometer delayed, every road contested, every village defended mattered, even if the outcome was already decided. Outmatched does not mean irrelevant, and obsolete does not mean useless. The Panzer IV proved this lesson repeatedly, fighting on long after more ambitious designs failed to appear in meaningful strength. Inside the Panzer IV, the war was experienced at human scale. 5 men shared a cramped, noisy, dangerous space where survival depended less on armor thickness than on coordination, discipline, and routine developed under fire. Compared to heavier German tanks, the Panzer IV was familiar and predictable. Crews knew its sounds, its weaknesses, and its limits. They understood how far they could push the engine, how quickly the gun could be brought onto target, and how long they could remain in position before enemy artillery or aircraft responded. This familiarity bred confidence, and confidence kept units functioning even as conditions deteriorated. German training emphasized crew cohesion. Commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator functioned as a single organism. In combat, seconds mattered. Orders had to be short, movements precise. A well-drilled Panzer IV crew could engage, fire, relocate, and disappear before the enemy fully reacted. But the strain was relentless. By the later years of the war, crews were exhausted, undertrained replacements filled empty seats, and supply shortages affected everything from fuel quality to ammunition availability. Losses were no longer temporary setbacks. They were permanent reductions in capability. Still, Panzer IV crews fought on. They defended crossroads, supported infantry withdrawals, and counterattacked when ordered, even when success was unlikely. The tank was no longer a symbol of victory, but of endurance. In many ways, the Panzer IV's true strength was not its gun or armor, but the men inside it, soldiers who continued to fight a losing war with professionalism, skill, and grim determination, long after the promise of victory had faded. The greatest strength of the Panzer IV was not brilliance at birth, but adaptability under pressure. Unlike many other tanks of the war, it did not remain frozen in its original role. As the battlefield changed, the Panzer IV changed with it. Originally designed as an infantry support tank, the Panzer IV carried a short-barreled gun intended to fire high-explosive shells at fortifications and enemy positions. This role made sense in the early campaigns, when German armored forces relied on speed, coordination, and shock to break resistance. But as the war expanded and enemy tanks grew stronger, this was no longer enough. Rather than abandon the design, German engineers transformed it. The Panzer IV received longer, more powerful guns capable of engaging enemy armor at increasing distances. Armor protection was reinforced. New sights, radios, and internal improvements followed. Step by step, the tank evolved from a supporting weapon into a true battlefield all-rounder. This adaptability kept the Panzer IV relevant long after many earlier designs became obsolete. While newer German tanks promised revolutionary performance, they arrived late, in small numbers, and with severe reliability problems. The Panzer IV, by contrast, could be upgraded within existing factories, repaired by familiar crews, and integrated smoothly into existing units. On the battlefield, this mattered. A Panzer IV from 1944 was not the same machine that rolled into Poland or France, but it shared the same logistical footprint, training pipeline, and operational logic. That continuity allowed German armored units to survive longer than they otherwise might have. The Panzer IV was never the most powerful tank on the field, but it was one of the few that could change fast enough to remain dangerous as the war itself changed around it. By the later years of the war, the Panzer IV was increasingly outmatched on paper. Allied tanks were appearing in ever greater numbers, often supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. Newer enemy designs were better armored, more numerous, and backed by stronger logistics. Yet despite this, The Panzer IV remained at the center of German armored units. This persistence was not accidental. The Panzer IV was available. While Tigers and Panthers captured attention, they were too rare to form the backbone of armored formations. The Panzer IV filled the gaps everywhere, defending retreats, counterattacking breakthroughs, and holding sectors where heavier tanks were unavailable or unsuitable. German crews learned to fight smarter rather than harder. Panzer IVs avoided open terrain whenever possible, using villages, forests, and defensive positions to negate enemy numerical advantage. Ambushes replaced head-on clashes. Cooperation with infantry and anti-tank guns became essential for survival. Losses were heavy. Many Panzer IV units were destroyed not because the tank was ineffective, but because they were committed against overwhelming force. Fuel shortages, constant movement, and lack of air cover drained crews physically and psychologically. Yet the tank continued to appear on every front, from Normandy to the Eastern Front. Unlike newer designs, the Panzer IV could still be repaired under poor conditions. Damaged vehicles were cannibalized to keep others running. Crews transferred between tanks without retraining. Even as Germany's situation collapsed, the Panzer IV remained usable, a critical advantage in a deteriorating war. By this stage, the Panzer IV no longer represented offensive ambition. It represented resistance. It was the tank that fought on, not because it promised victory, but because it was the only one that could still be fielded in meaningful numbers. Outnumbered, outgunned, and increasingly isolated, the Panzer IV continued to fight, not as a symbol of dominance, but as proof of endurance in a war Germany could no longer control. As Germany's front lines began to disintegrate in 1944 to 1945, the Panzer IV was no longer part of grand offensives or sweeping maneuvers. Instead, it became a tool of delay. Its role was to slow the inevitable, to buy time for retreating units, evacuations, and collapsing defensive lines. Panzer IVs were often thrown into combat with minimal preparation. Crews received orders to hold crossroads, towns, or river crossings for as long as possible. There were rarely reserves. Withdrawal plans were vague or non-existent. Many engagements ended with tanks fighting until ammunition ran out or fuel was exhausted. In these final battles, the Panzer IV's practicality again proved crucial. While heavier tanks were abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel, Panzer IVs could still move, still fire, still be repaired just enough to fight again. Even worn-out vehicles with mismatched parts were sent back into action. Allied forces frequently encountered Panzer IVs in desperate defensive positions, hull down behind rubble, concealed in forests, or dug in as static gun platforms. These were no longer maneuvers aimed at victory, but at survival. Each engagement was about minutes and hours, not territory. The human cost was immense. Crews knew the war was lost, yet they were ordered to continue fighting. Many did so out of duty, fear, or lack of alternatives. The Panzer IV became the machine through which this final phase of resistance was expressed. When the fighting ended, countless Panzer IVs were found abandoned, burned out, or captured intact. They stood as relics of a force that had outlasted its own strategic purpose. The collapse of the Wehrmacht did not erase the Panzer IV from the battlefield. It carried Germany through the final collapse, not as a weapon of hope, but as the last functioning instrument of a broken army. When the Second World War ended, the Panzer IV quietly faded from the front lines, but not from history. Unlike Germany's heavier and more famous tanks, It did not become a symbol of excess or failure. Instead, it stood as a reminder of something far more important: sustainability. The Panzer IV was not the most powerful tank of the war. It was not the most heavily armored, nor the most feared. Yet it fought everywhere, from Poland to France, from the deserts of North Africa to the ruins of Berlin. Few armored vehicles in history served so long, across so many phases of a single conflict. Its true strength lay in adaptability. The Panzer IV evolved continuously, accepting new guns, additional armor, and revised roles as the battlefield changed. While other designs were replaced or sidelined, the Panzer IV remained relevant because it could be modified faster than Germany could design an entirely new tank. Post-war analysis highlighted this reality. Military planners studying the Wehrmacht's armored forces concluded that the Panzer IV, not the Tiger or Panther, had carried the true burden of Germany's armored war. It filled gaps. It stabilized fronts. It compensated for shortages. It did the unglamorous work that keeps armies alive. Many Panzer IVs continued to serve after 1945, exported to other nations, and used in regional conflicts for years. This longevity confirmed what the war had already proven. The design was practical, understandable, and maintainable, qualities that outlast ideology and circumstance. History remembers the Tiger for its terror. It remembers the Panther for its promise, but it remembers the Panzer IV for its endurance. It was not the tank that defined German ambition. It was the tank that made German armored warfare possible at all. And in that role, it earned its place as the true backbone of the Wehrmacht.